Throughout history, the technology of war has continually changed, but the art of war, how a commander commands, has remained more or less the same.
Nations have gone out of existence because of their failure to understand what war is all about, including its diplomatic, economic, and social elements. A great commander, one way or another, always seems to understand how all these forces are interrelated.
In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, fought perhaps the finest campaign of his life, a campaign that culminated here in the fields near the Czech town of Austerlitz. Outnumbered by a combined Austrian-Russian army, Napoleon's only hope lay in luring his enemy into a deadly trap. Few commanders have elicited as much adulation as Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a ruthless master of war whose daunting skills led him not only to dominate Europe for 20 years, but to change it forever.
Napoleon is a character of such stature and interest, I think, that it is very difficult for anybody not to feel a certain amount of fascination for him. Here we have a young man of relatively humble origins who emerges as the greatest captain of modern history, second only probably to Alexander the Great in all recorded history. And the way in which his story is won from very humble origins, therefore, to have great peaks of achievement, and emperor no less, and then, of course, the complete collapse, ultimately. It's a real rags to riches to rags story.
Europe in the 18th century was a shifting mosaic of nations and principalities dominated by the great powers of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and France. The Mediterranean island of Corsica had belonged to France for only a year, when in 1769, Carlo and Letizia Bonaparte gave birth to their second son, Napoleone. Little did they realize that among their 8 children who survived infancy, there would one day be 3 kings, a queen, and an emperor. At the age of 9, the Italian-speaking Napoleone was sent to learn French at school in mainland France. It was a difficult period. Short for his age and with a foreign-sounding accent, Napoleon was constantly bullied. But he was a determined young man and did not allow this to prevent him from graduating to military school in Paris. From there, he joined the artillery and settled into a period of intense study.
I think it is the sheer intellectuality of Napoleon which lies at the heart of his greatness. Unlike most generals who learn by experience, little by little, for a whole long career, how to go about their military business, Napoleon is the rare exception of a man who learnt a great deal of the art of warfare from books at a very early stage in his career. As he once said years later, "I have fought 60 battles, and yet I know nothing now which I did not know at the beginning." Now, some people think that's a very arrogant remark to make, but on the other hand, it has a kernel of truth in it, because it was in the year 1788, when he was at Auxonne and had something like 15 to 18 months available for very heavy study, that he really laid the foundations for all his future concepts. He was very clever at ripping out the guts from books, other men's ideas, if you like. But of course, the difference between being able to have the idea and to put them into practice, that was a big difference, of course. He's the great executor of warfare.
In 1789, when Napoleon was 20, France was shaken by revolution. The monarchy was overthrown, and much of the existing officer class went with it. But the newly born republic was soon to be at war with most of Europe. It was to be a time of great opportunity for ambitious young soldiers who had few ties with the old regime. Napoleon's chance came when he pushed his way to the position of artillery commander at the siege of the monarchist port of Toulon. His inspired use of the guns and his courage during the assault made him the hero of the successful siege, and at 24, he was promoted to the rank of general. By the age of 26, he had been given command of the French army in Italy. Revolutionary France's 5-year war with the other great European powers had reached stalemate. The French army, fighting the Austrians for control of Italy, was a ragged, hungry, ill-equipped and thoroughly dispirited body of men. Napoleon, however, was able to fire them with new enthusiasm.
Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness?
His energy revitalized the army. His generals, at first dismissive of this youth, found themselves increasingly impressed by his determination, his detailed knowledge of the enemy, and his dynamism. In a series of battles, Napoleon, with fewer than 40,000 men, overwhelmed the 80,000-strong army of his complacent opponent. By January 1797, he had taken the surrender of the Austrian emperor.
In Italy, Napoleon showed that through maneuver and rapid marches, he could overcome the superior numbers on the enemy's side. And he beat antiquated generals and old men who lacked his energy. It's really a new kind of war, war which harnesses nationalism and in which maneuver is more important almost than fighting. It's almost like comparing Haydn to Beethoven. And just think of the energy and the rules of music that Beethoven broke to produce his great music. And that's the way I think of Napoleon.
Following his successes in Italy, he was sent to seize Turkish-controlled Egypt in an attempt to weaken the British by cutting their trade routes to the east. But the defeat of his fleet by the British and the strength of Turkish resistance thwarted his plans. He decided to abandon his remaining soldiers to their fate and return to pursue political ambitions in Paris. By 1799, France had fallen further into turmoil. Napoleon, his great popularity undiminished, took part in a dramatic coup which brought him to political power. By now commander of the armed forces, he soon threw off his political allies and, aged 30, made himself first consul, supreme head of the Republic. By 1800, Napoleon's armies had again defeated Austria. 2 years later, a peace treaty with Britain was finally secured, and the French Republic's endless wars seemed to have come to a conclusion. And on a wave of public support, he made himself consul for life. Night and day, he worked to reform and improve state administration, trade, law, education, and religion. In doing so, he created a nation capable of supporting his military ambitions. A new constitution allowed him to appoint generals, judges, and ministers. France was in his power. In December 1804, with great ceremony, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French.
Napoleon remained in many ways the Corsican bandit chief, or the head of the Corsican extended family. The Corsican dimension had probably two main importances for Napoleon. First of all, he had the detachment of an outsider towards his host nation. And it's remarkable when you look at history how often the outsider from an outlandish village with a strange name, a peculiar provincial or even foreign accent is able to energize a host nation. And I think here we can call to mind not just Napoleon, but Hitler, Stalin, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and Saddam Hussein himself.
Between old monarchies and a young republic, a spirit of hostility must always exist. In the present state of affairs, every peace treaty means no more than a brief armistice.
Underlying hostilities between France and Britain had erupted again in 1803. Napoleon massed his armies on the Channel coast, intending to invade. The British, meanwhile, had persuaded the Austrian and Russian emperors to also declare war on France. Facing a coalition that could destroy him, Napoleon began work on the campaign that would lead him to Austerlitz.
I think probably the campaign that makes the most impression, certainly the one that shows Napoleon at his greatest, would be Austerlitz, where he determines in great secrecy that he's going to strike an enemy building up in his rear. Napoleon at that time was ostensibly planning to invade England. He orchestrated the moves of his grand army, each corps taking different paths, so that they would come at the right place at the right time. But this is the first clear proof anybody had that warfare had changed.
The 1805 campaign was to be the peak of Napoleon's military career, bringing into play all the factors that made him a truly great commander. The Revolutionary Wars had created a nation at arms.
All Frenchmen are permanently requisitioned for service into the armies. Young men will go forth into battle. Married men will forge weapons and transport munitions. Women will make tents and clothing and serve in the hospitals. Children will make lint from old linen. And old men will be brought to the public square to arouse the courage of the soldiers while preaching the unity of the Republic.
Napoleon refined this new military force and renamed it La Grande Armée, the Great Army. He organized it into self-contained corps, miniature armies capable of fighting alone if necessary, but never more than a day's march apart. The size of each corps varied from 10,000 to 40,000, depending on its role and Napoleon's confidence in its commander. Men of talent, like his second-in-command, Berthier, were promoted almost irrespective of age or class. By 1805, the army had an imperial headquarters of 400 officers capable of turning the emperor's often complex orders into clear instructions.
He had a mind for detail that blows the imagination. Every 2 weeks he read the muster rolls for an army of, 800,000 men. There are letters in his correspondence where he'd go back raising a question. There's a discrepancy between the most recent rolls and the one before. Could you explain that? Once he commissioned or sent some engineer officers to make a study of all the guns in position on the English Channel. And when they came back with their report, he looked at it and said, you may have forgotten that 4-gun battery behind the sand dune. I forget which town it was. The amazing thing to me about Napoleon is he could master detail without wallowing around in it. He made detail work for him. He never let it overcome him. In that sense, he was a genius.
Napoleon knew that above all, his success depended on the loyalty of his men.
A general's principal talent consists in knowing the mentality of the soldier and gaining his confidence.
With certificates, parades, medals, and a deft personal touch, he won the army's confidence.
Napoleon's genius as a military commander, preeminently, I think, was that he changed the rules of the game and he organized his corps and his army accordingly. And all was designed to exploit time, essentially, to exploit time and space. And he was great as a strategist. And he understood that if he could get inside his enemy's, always be inside his enemy's decision-making cycle, and we see this in numerous campaigns, that if he could do that, that even if mistakes were made by one or more of his corps commanders or by himself, that he would always have the advantage over his opponent. And he had always had this enormous confidence in his own ability to exploit advantages and ultimately to gain victory over his opponent. Although he might have lost tactically at certain times, he always won strategically. Never ask of me anything but time, he said. I will lose a man, but never a moment.
By the autumn of 1805, Napoleon was with his army at Boulogne, still intending to invade Britain. When informed by his network of spies that the Austrians and the Russians were both moving against him, Napoleon abandoned his invasion plans. He then ordered 210,000 men to march towards the river Danube and intercept the Austrians coming towards him. He kept 30,000 men at Boulogne to confuse the enemy into thinking he still intended to invade Britain. In fact, he wanted to fight the Austrians before the Russians arrived to help them. By forcing the bulk of his army to march at great speed, he was able to completely surround the Austrians at the Bavarian city of Ulm before a Russian army could arrive to help them. The Austrian general Mack was completely taken by surprise and was forced to surrender 60,000 troops. The commander of the Russian forces, Kutuzov, was amazed to hear of his allies' defeat. He turned his army around and marched back along the Danube, hoping to gather any remaining Austrians and call up Russian reinforcements. Napoleon chased Kutuzov along the Danube, but he escaped. On the 15th of November, the French took Vienna and all its military supplies, then continued north in pursuit until they arrived near the town of Austerlitz. By now, the French army was becoming exhausted.
We were worn out with fatigue, wet through with rain and snow, nipped with cold and camped in the mud. But in spite of our misery, the presence of our emperor made us bear it all. The emperor knew of our wants and our fatigue, which he shared. He was aware, too, that the soldiers grumbled, and he said, "They're right, but it is to spare their blood that I make them undergo these hardships." When we heard that, he could have made us do what no one else could.
Napoleon's lines of supply and communication were stretched to the limit, which had reduced his fighting force to only 50,000 men compared with the enemy's 85,000. He was also concerned that Prussia might take advantage of his weakness and intervene with a force of 200,000 troops. Unless he could defeat the combined Russian and Austrian armies soon, he would be forced to retreat.
A great commander ought to say to himself several times a day, if the enemy appear on my front, My right or my left? What should I do? If he finds himself embarrassed, he is ill-posted.
Napoleon was heavily outnumbered. He knew he would only be able to regain the advantage by forcing the Allies to fight on his terms. And so he determined to lure them into a trap. In doing so, he demonstrated one of his great skills, the ability to exploit geography.
I'd love to have seen him with the officer who kept his maps on campaign as they crawled around on their knees, placing troops and deciding what orders Napoleon would issue that night for his troops to follow the next morning. I think Napoleon at work, more than Napoleon in battle, would be the most fascinating picture that I can think of. Napoleon was a master of maps. He could look at a map which told him not only where he could move troops, but where the enemy was likely to move troops, because he could get into their thought process. And he could orchestrate a campaign so that all of his troops would appear where he wanted them at about the right time. If it worked according to his plan, the battle was almost a foregone conclusion that he would win.
Napoleon began to investigate the land that lay between him and his opponents. He hoped to find a suitable site for battle, and in an area of hills, villages, and shallow lakes, he succeeded.
The Emperor went out every day to make reconnaissances along the line and returned satisfied. He seemed delighted. His pinches of snuff took effect. This was always proof of his contentment. And with his hands behind his back, he went about talking to everyone. Gentlemen, examine this ground carefully. It is going to be a battlefield. You will have a part to play on it.
The French were camped to the west of Austerlitz. The Russians and Austrians, now accompanied by Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, were some miles to the east. First, he sent his troops to occupy the dominating hills in the middle of his chosen area of action. He wanted his adversaries to see he only had about 50,000 men, some on the hills and others behind in the valley. For his plan to succeed, it was crucial that the enemy, almost outnumbering Napoleon 2-1, would feel so confident of success that it would attack without waiting for further Austrian, Russian, or even Prussian reinforcements. Napoleon, for his part, was relying on the swift arrival of 25,000 soldiers that he had urgently sent for. To show his apparent weakness and play for a little more time, he agreed to discuss an armistice. A Russian envoy came to Napoleon's camp and lectured him on European politics. Napoleon listened so politely that when the envoy returned to the Allies, he reported that the French army is on the eve of its doom. Napoleon then ordered his troops on the Pratzen Heights to make an obvious retreat. The Russians and Austrians looked on in amazement and gratefully moved forward to take over the now vacant French positions. He deliberately left his right wing appearing weak and vulnerable. If the Austrians and Russians were tempted into launching an all-out attack against this wing, it would leave the subsequently poorly defended Pratzen Heights open to a French counterattack. Unknown to the enemy, Napoleon's reinforcements were arriving. The trap was set.
Napoleon's tactical plan for Austerlitz was essentially to lure the Allies forward into a giant ambush. To that end, he pulled his forces off the commanding ground of the Pratzen Plateau and pulled them back into low-lying, rather swampy ground to the rear, and the odds were at that time of year it was going to be covered in mist, so his forces effectively were going to be almost completely out of view. Once the Allies were advancing across the Pratzen Plateau and were descending towards what they thought was the open French right flank, then the whole of the French army would execute a kind of giant clockwise wheel and close in on the flank of the advancing Allies. That was it. Like most great schemes of battle, it was essentially very simple.
By the 1st of December, Napoleon felt ready. That evening, after supper at an inn near the battle site, he issued his orders for the next day.
Soldiers, I shall in person direct you. I shall keep out of range so long as you, with your accustomed bravery, carry disorder and confusion into the ranks of the enemy. But if the victory is for a moment uncertain, you shall see your emperor in the front rank. We cannot afford to let victory slip from our grasp on a day like this, when the honor of France is at stake.
He knew how to motivate soldiers. His speeches. He once wrote, I think it was his brother, maybe his stepson, saying, Livy never understood war. The speeches he puts in Caesar's mouth would not motivate soldiers. I know what motivates men. And he did. And I'm sure many of the French soldiers were fighting for Napoleon more than they were fighting for France.
In the night which preceded this memorable day, the emperor visited the bivouacs of his troops on foot. Suddenly, the camp was illuminated by thousands of burning torches which each bivouac raised aloft to salute the emperor and to celebrate the anniversary of his coronation. Napoleon, deeply touched by this improvised act of homage, expressed his regret at having on the morrow to fight a battle which would rob him of a large number of these good fellows, and added that he considered this the best evening of his life.
He knew that the following day his soldiers would be outnumbered. He was confident that their courage, inspired and nurtured by their almost fanatical reverence for their emperor, would bring him success. In the early hours of the morning, troops began to take up their positions for battle. As Napoleon had expected, the valley below the Pratzen Heights was blanketed in a dense fog. At 6 a.m., Napoleon watched as his enemy made their first moves, sending, as he had hoped, troops against his right. Some of the attacking troops, in confusion, went towards the French left. Clear commands were in short supply, due partly to the fog, partly to the continuing friction between Austrian and Russian officers, and partly from interfering emperors. Nevertheless, slower than hoped, their troops moved against the French right. On the right, the 10,000 French defenders slowly gave ground, but their lines remained unbroken, thanks largely to the arrival of more French reinforcements who had marched from Vienna. As Napoleon had expected, the Austro-Russian center on the Pratzen Heights weakened as troops were continually sent to reinforce the advance against the French right. Napoleon had carefully concealed over 10,000 men in the fog, and at exactly 9 a.m. he snapped shut his telescope and ordered the attack.
Let us put an end to this campaign with a crash of thunder that will stun the enemy. Our battalions mounted the hill. Contrary to custom, the Emperor had ordered that the bands should remain in position in the center of each battalion. The drums beat a charge loud enough to break their drumheads in. The drums and the music mingled together. It was enough to make a paralytic move forward.
The Allied commander Kutuzov looked down from the Pratzen Heights with satisfaction. Though an attack to the north had stalled, the heavily outnumbered French right on the south would surely soon fall. Suddenly he was amazed to see enemy soldiers emerging from the fog towards him. He immediately ordered troops heading south to return and help him, but it was too late. By 11 a.m., the French retook the Pratzen Heights, and Napoleon moved his command post there. For 3 desperate hours, Kutuzov launched bitter counterattacks. Finally, the elite Russian Imperial Guard charged with all their force.
The Russian Imperial Guard was composed of gigantic men who fought with desperation. Our cavalry was driven back. Then, the Emperor let loose his black horses, that is, his mounted grenadiers. They passed by us like a streak of lightning and fell upon the enemy. For a quarter of an hour, there was a desperate struggle, and that quarter of an hour seemed to us an age. We could see nothing through the smoke and dust. We were advancing slowly behind them, and if they had been defeated, it would have been our turn. There was confusion, and no one knew who had the upper hand. But our grenadiers came off conquerors and returned to their positions behind the Emperor.
By early afternoon, the remains of the Allied center had been obliterated. At 2 p.m., Napoleon prepared to attack the enemy to his north, but there the Allies were already withdrawing. Always ready to respond to circumstance, he ordered an attack against the enemy to his south instead. It was a brutal but conclusive success.
Up to the last hour of the battle, we took no prisoners. It would just not do to take any risks. One could stick at nothing, and thus, not a single living enemy remained to our rear.
The battle was won. The Austro-Russian troops ran for their lives, leaving behind at least 13,000 dead and injured and 12,000 prisoners. The French had lost 9,000.
Soldiers, I am pleased with you. It will suffice that you shall say, I was at the Battle of Austerlitz, for them to reply, there goes a brave man.
Austerlitz is without a doubt Napoleon's greatest battle achievement. With a very weak army, at extreme end of his lines of communications, he was able to dominate the enemy to such a degree that he virtually dictated the actions they were going to take for them. And this is a very rare thing to be able to achieve. He lured them to attack him because he seemed to be so weak, when in fact he was bringing up extra forces to join him on the eve of battle, which made a great difference to the balance of power on the actual 2nd of December. He then induced them by apparently leaving his right wing weak, that's to say, part of his army towards Vienna, where his lines of communication apparently ran. So he got the enemy to make a big attack in that direction, which is exactly what he wanted them to do, aware that by doing so they almost certainly weakened their centre, which he then, of course, occupied in the middle of the battle, and then enveloped their southern wing, for results we all well know. It was a masterly battle of control and, above all, of design, I feel.
Napoleon was master of Europe. At the nearby castle of Austerlitz, Francis of Austria agreed an armistice. Tsar Alexander had fled back to Russia.
It was amazing that although Napoleon's common sense amounted to genius, he never quite knew where the possible left off.
Napoleon was always fighting. I don't know if it was for personal glory. Maybe what he really thought was, I don't want all the territory in the world, I just want that part that touches mine. Sooner or later that gets you involved in Russia, Egypt, and various other places. I think also he had momentum. Success breeds success, certainly breeds confidence. What he didn't, I think, understand is that the nationalism that fueled Napoleon's armies ultimately began to infect those of his opponents. the Germans, the Russians, Spanish, even the Austrians. They too marched with the same enthusiasm toward the end of the period.
Austerlitz had made Napoleon feel invincible. In 1806, he again fought and defeated the Russians and their Prussian allies. In an attempt to weaken the British, Napoleon imposed an economic blockade throughout Europe. Portugal refused to cooperate, and Napoleon invaded. For 5 years, his soldiers struggled against fierce resistance in Portugal and then Spain. The campaign fought in his absence was a dismal failure, costing the lives of 220,000 men. In Europe, his behavior prevented any hope of peace. His brothers were made kings. Any rebellion ruthlessly and bloodily opposed. In 1809, he fought and defeated the Austrians. Then, in 1812, he attacked Russia. His plans were meticulous, but he failed to account for the Tsar's continued retreat, which drew the French further and further east. The sparsely populated and badly farmed Eastern European lands could not provide for such a massive force. The army began to starve.
We received no meat nor vegetables, so that from hunger 30 men killed ourselves a dog, and have picked nettles, and have cooked us a greenery dish with the dog's fat, and eaten the meat for much hunger. For in the Polish lands there's so little to live on that it would be little wonder if one would at the end starve to death.
The campaign was a disaster. Winter set in, and Napoleon was forced to retreat.
He watched his army pass by in the most wretched condition. What he may have felt in his heart is impossible to surmise. His outward appearance seemed indifferent and unconcerned over the wretchedness of his soldiers. Only ambition and lost honor may have made themselves felt in his heart. And although the soldiers shouted into his ears many oaths and curses about his own guilty person, he was still able to listen to them unmoved.
Of the 600,000 who set out, only 75,000 survived. Still, Napoleon refused to give up. He raised a new army of 500,000 conscripts, but by October 1813, this too had been defeated in Germany and France.
Napoleon undeniably made positive contributions to European history, but personally I believe that the destruction he wrought more than outweighs that. Considering the losses the French suffered in his wars alone, something like 1 million men failed to come back from the wars of Napoleon.
In war, men are nothing. One man is everything. What are 1 million men compared to a man such as I?
Then we have the dark, negative side of his personality. The way he was cynically amused by the way men obeyed his behest, how easily they were led, how easily their ambitions were fed. We have his cynical abandonment of armies in Egypt in 1799 and again in Russia in 1812. And we have the betrayal of his soldiers' trust at the crucial Battle of Waterloo, when towards the end, when the Prussian army is intervening, Napoleon tries to persuade his soldiers that these are French reinforcements on the way to save them.
I think in some ways you can compare Napoleon to a Hitler or to a Stalin, although I loathe the thought he was far better than they, but he was a dictator. He did subordinate national interests to his own ambitions. He could be very cruel, but he could also be very enlightened. I think he ran a pretty efficient government, and he confused his own aim and French national interests because he thought that the two were the same. As you look back on it now, you could see where they diverged. In no way was it the French interest to invade Russia. But I think Napoleon, the commander, will hold up very well in history.
In early 1814, Napoleon, facing military defeat in Paris itself, abdicated and tried unsuccessfully to poison himself. He was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba. In France, the monarchy was restored. Napoleon had one move left. On March the 1st, 1815, he escaped back to France. He rallied support and the king fled. He had regained power, but his European enemies vowed to destroy him. To survive, he needed a major military victory. On the 18th of June, he faced a joint British-Prussian force at the Battle of Waterloo. The weight of numbers against him proved decisive. It was a final and conclusive defeat. He was sent back into exile, this time to the small island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from France. With little to do but write his memoirs, Napoleon fell ill, and in 1821, aged 51, he died. "19 years later, his body was returned to France and given a hero's burial. His life was already legend. He had changed the world.
I think Napoleon is responsible for many enduring changes. Modern nationalism, he didn't invent it in France, but I think he certainly encouraged it in the other countries as he was fighting them. The Napoleonic law code that he introduced. He really sort of paved the way, I think, for the modern world. And you could not go back to the pre-Napoleonic world. They tried for the first generation after Waterloo, but people had changed, and they would not accept the old world. And Napoleon is not just the figurehead there, he was the primary engineer.
I've always had a double view on Napoleon. It's best reflected, I feel, in what the Earl of Clarendon, the royalist historian of the great English Civil War, said of Oliver Cromwell. He was a great bad man.
An estimated 2.5 million men died as a result of his ambition. But as with other great commanders, it is the memory of his military triumphs and civilian achievements that have made him a figure of legend. His ruthlessness and arrogance prevented him from securing a lasting peace and ultimately led to his fall. But, despite this failure, Napoleon Bonaparte remains the foremost soldier in European history.